You heard about, I'm in the Southwest, so there is a lot of information. Now, some people scoff at it and they say, oh, that's not possible. Pyramids in the Grand Canyon, trails that have been cut off that you can't go into certain caves, Egyptian artifacts found, but most compelling is a connection between the Hopi Native American tribes and Egypt. They have a lot of language, a lot of culture that is being called a phenomenon of, I can't remember what it's called, diffusion, or it can't be explained, but there definitely is a presence of Egyptian history in the Southwest with the Hopi. And so, have you heard of that? I'm just saying,
Yeah,
I won't beat it too long, the dead horse,
I've
but I get it.
seen lots of people trying to make connections, but it's being hampered, I would say, by the people who are too keen for this to happen, and they
Okay.
are inventing history. They are falsifying history. I was at a conference in Chicago, and they were showing Egyptian artifacts, and it was quite obvious that these were recent forgeries. They weren't Egyptian at all.
Mm-hmm.
And that just muddies the water. And I wish people wouldn't do that, because how can we actually prove that the Egyptians got to America if people are continuously falsifying information all the time? It just
I agree.
really doesn't help the situation, because they might well have done, but the information, we need better information. We need better archaeology to prove that that happens. I mean, there was one thing I found recently, which I found interesting. It's by no means conclusive. But if you compare um, the site at Göbekli Tepe,
Mm-hmm.
which is it's the oldest temple in the whole of the world, which is actually at Edessa, the city I keep writing about and talking about in terms of the New Testament. Göbekli Tepe is at Edessa. But the site of Göbekli Tepe, if you look at it and look at its functions, looks exactly the same as the temple site at Chaco Canyon, which is that in Nevada, or is it it's down there in south
Chaco,
central
how do you spell it?
Chaco, Chaco. It's one of the ancient Indian sites
Oh,
in
taco.
America. It's
We
well
say
worth.
taco out here in the
You probably
Southwest.
pronounce it differently to me. It's probably something else.
It is in New Mexico.
It's in New Mexico. Yeah, it's a wonderful site. Uh, a very atmospheric site. You know, it's got this canyon you go down, which is like a miniature sort of Death Valley sort of thing, or a
Yeah.
miniature Grand Canyon. Um, and then you come to this big temple site
Oh, it's
built by the
beautiful.
Chaco Indians. And it's got these big circular temple areas with two
Hmm.
posts in the middle. And behind, you've got all of these rooms in this big sort of complex that looks like a block of flats, you know,
Should I
looks
screen
like,
share? I have
yeah,
I'm not,
sure, yeah, looks like apartment buildings
wow,
behind
it's
it.
wonderful. Okay, let's
Um,
see.
but that is exactly what we see. Yeah, that's Checo. That's one of the circular sites. And you can see we've got two square and circular post areas. There must have been something in those two, uh, like a totem pole or a standing stone or something in those two areas. And this big circular construction is obviously some sort of temple complex. Now there's about 4 of them on the Chaco site. I don't know if you've got another picture there of the whole site, but that's exactly what we see at Göbekli Tepe. We've got the big circular enclosures at Göbekli Tepe with the 2 standing stones in the center, exactly like we do at Chaco Canyon. And I wonder if I've got an image of the whole site, because I was doing a talk on this previously. Let's see if I've got anything under Chaco.
Oh,
Yes, I've got one here. So if I bring up these.
oh wow, I do see the similarities. It's uncanny.
So can I do a screen share from my end? Or I've got to put it in that page there first, otherwise it's not going to share. So if I go to screen share on my side and share.
Oh.
So that's the same. In fact, your picture was better there. That's the circular structure, but my camera would only take half of it. So you can't see the whole circular structure. But if we look at the plan of the site, which is this next one, you'll see there's lots of these circular structures. And these are sort of like the temple areas. And then behind, you've got all these apartment buildings. You see the number of buildings. On the right side, they're going up to 240 something, 250. So a huge number of buildings. Oh, left side, 372. So there's loads and loads of these apartment buildings to the rear. And here it is, not on a plan, but from an aerial shot, you can see there. You've got the big circular temple enclosures and then all of these apartment buildings behind. And I don't think this is a city at all.
You don't?
I think this is a necropolis.
Mm.
And so, because there's nothing around here, it's just it's in the middle of nowhere. And I think you bring your dead and you have some sort of ceremony in these big circular enclosures. And then you take your dead to be buried in these rooms behind. And of course, if they were using the standard sort of Israelite burial practice, all you do is you leave the body there for 3 or 4 years. And then you come back and you collect up the bones and take the bones home again. So you would never find, yeah, that's standard Judaism even to this day. So you would never see any burials here because the people were all taken away again. You come back in 4 years and you take them away. I think that's what they were doing here, because you imagine in the ancient days, what did people spend their money on? They didn't spend it on domestic architecture. They spent it on temples, palaces, and necropolises, the cities of the dead. Because sending the dead on their way to the afterlife was a big part of people's life in those days. It was the most essential thing, is to give yourself everlasting life that you could go on in the world beyond. And so they spent an awful lot of time and money on burying their dead. And I think that's what this site is doing at Chaco Canyon. So this is another look inside one of those circular enclosures. But then if we go to Göbekli Tepe, what do we find? We find circular enclosures and all of these square buildings behind. Here's Göbekli again, big circular enclosure with 2 standing stones. Remember, in those circular things, we've got, as in your picture, we've got these placings for 2 maybe large stelae, large stones in this circular construction. Well, that's exactly what we find at Göbekli Tepe as well. We've got 2 very large standing stones in the middle of a circle. And it's not clear on here. Here's the big circular enclosures. But now towards the back of this area, they're finding all of these square rooms at Göbekli Tepe. And they're saying, oh, it's a city. People were living here. Look, we've got rooms now. We've proved that this is a city. But hold on a minute. All of these square rooms at the back of Göbekli Tepe have miniature T-pillars in it. So in the center, this is Göbekli Tepe. All of these big circles have T-pillars. Here's the 2 big T-pillars, and then you get 12 other T-pillars around the circumference, as if it is representing the zodiac, maybe. But the square rooms behind have miniature T-pillars in them, indicating that those rooms are not secular rooms for living in. They are spiritual, they are religious, they are sacred because they have little tiny T-pillars in them. In which case, those rooms behind are most probably for the dead. And so I think Göbekli Tepe is exactly the same as this site at Chaco Canyon, where it was a huge, great necropolis with enough room for thousands of burials. The other conundrum they had at Chaco Canyon is all of these apartment blocks at the back, the square rooms, they have no windows and they have no chimneys. You can't live in these sort of places without a chimney to cook your food. So they are pretty worthless as apartment blocks go. But of course, the dead don't need windows and the dead don't need chimneys. And so again, I think this is...
That's very interesting. I wanted to just jump in and try to ask you, wouldn't it be easy to prove that people live there from, like, you know, different, I guess, what is it, artifacts that would be left behind if it was a living space?
Well, the artifacts that they found at Chaco Canyon are not conclusive that people were living there. They have midden pits and they are full of pottery and so on. But of course, if you were bringing the dead, you would bring offerings for those dead. And those pots, you wouldn't take the pots home. And so those pots would be broken and put in the midden pits. And so there's nothing really at Chaco Canyon that confirms that this was a living, breathing city. Obviously, you would need a number of janitors there. So you might have 100 staff who are actually living there. So there would be evidence of some people living there. But they were just looking after the site and keeping it functioning as a necropolis, while the rest of the people in all of the apartment buildings were dead. And I think both, but the odd thing is, and I only bring this up because you were talking about connections with the Americas, is we've got these two sites in two different continents, which seem very, very similar. But the other problem is we've got 10,000 years between these two sites. So Chaco Canyon is supposed to be quite recent. It's only supposed to be about 1,000 years old or so, whereas Göbekli Tepe is supposed to be like 11,000 years old. So we've got 10,000 years between these two sites on two different continents. And yet there seems to be a number of similarities between the two. And so if you're looking for connections between the Americas and between sort of, you know, the European sphere of influence, that is one. But I can't explain how those traditions would have survived for quite so long and been transferred out to the Americas. I mean, that's difficult to explain. But anyway, there are similarities. So, yeah. So that for the people in America who keep trying to prove that the Egyptians went to America, please keep it real. Keep it based in fact, and don't try to over egg the pudding. Don't try and make things up, because you're just muddying the waters and making it harder and harder for anyone to believe that there were contacts. But possibly, yes, there were.